I want to touch on a couple of topics that didn't make the cut in Age of Deceit 2, Alchemy, and the Rise of the Beast image, but are nonetheless extremely important. In this video, I want to tackle androgyny and the Antichrist. The Merriam-Webster defines androgynous as, quote, 1. Having the characteristics or nature of both male and female. 2. Neither specifically feminine nor masculine. 3. Having traditional male and female roles obscured or reversed. Many occult traditions possess an obscure and twisted interpretation of the biblical account of creation and cosmology. The various threads of alchemical cosmologies fall right in line, in particular regarding the creation of Adam and Eve. Here is how the late Bill Cooper, conspiracy theorist and author of Behold a Pale Horse, describes the alchemical traditions of the creation process and the occult worldview that prevails the elite initiates.
Those who have studied the writings of the ancient alchemists have always been much mystified by what is said concerning the Philosopher's Stone and the process of transmuting the base metals into gold. These claims have naturally given rise to a great deal of vague speculation, and as we are standing upon the threshold of a new age, where this precious jewel, with all of its power, will be evolved and possessed by a considerable number of people, we feel that it is important to divest the subject of all the mystery that surrounds it and speak in plain terms concerning the matter. We are taught that in the beginning, God created heaven and earth, the whole universe, in fact, and we understand that this great creative force expresses itself either as will or imagination. Now, by imagination, the great architect of the universe must first have visualized everything as it was first created, and then, by his will, the physical atoms were marshaled into this matrix of thought, thus gradually bringing the universe into manifestation as designed by its creator. Nor is this process complete, but will continue until the whole has become perfect as originally designed. The divine hierarchies who have carried out the plan of the great creator also used the same dual creative force when fashioning the crystal in the mineral, the leaf of the plant, or the shape of the animal. Their powerful imagination pictures in the archetypal region of the earth that which they desire to create, and their concentrated will molds the coarser matter into this matrix until it assumes a definite physical form as desired. Man, the spirit, has a like creative power, and has through ages, under the guidance of the gods, plural, learned to build bodies of increasing value as instruments for his expression. But his pilgrimage through matter was undertaken for the purpose of making him an independent creative intelligence, and to attain that end, it was necessary that he should, at the proper time, be emancipated from the guardianship of the gods, so that he might learn to create not only for himself, but also to aid and to teach others in the great school of life. During the course of his evolution, man has become more and more enlightened concerning the mystery of life, but nevertheless, it is only a few hundred years ago when life and liberty were endangered by the expression of opinions in advance of the commonly accepted views. It was for this reason that the alchemists, who had studied more deeply than the majority, were forced to embody their teachings in highly allegorical and symbolical language. Their teaching concerning the spiritual evolution of man, and their use of the terms salt, sulfur, mercury, and azoth, so mystifying to the masses, were nevertheless rooted in cosmic truths, highly illuminating to the initiate. The students of the Rosicrucian teachings who have learned how the world came into being and the process of gradual creation should have no difficulty in properly understanding every part of the alchemist language. We know in the first place that there was a time when man in the making was a hermaphrodite, male-female, and able to create from himself. And we remember also that at that time he was like the plant in other respects. His consciousness was like that which we possess in dreamless sleep, and which is possessed by the plant. The vital energy which he absorbed into his body was used solely for the purpose of growing until the time of propagation came, when a new budding body was cast off to grow also. There was no incentive to action, but if there had been, man would have had no mind or will to direct it. For the emancipation of humanity from this negative condition, one half of the creative force was turned upward under the direction of the angels for the purpose of building a larynx and a brain, that man might learn to create by thought as do the divine hierarchies and express the creative thought in words. Thus man ceased to be a physically hermaphrodite and became unisexual. He could no longer create from himself physically as do the hermaphrodite plants, nor psychically as do the Elohim, the male-female hierarchs in whose image he was originally made, and thus he occupies at the present time an unenviable intermediate position between the plant and the God. At the time when one half of the human sex force was diverted for the purpose of building the brain, men were helpless and lacking in knowledge of how to overcome conditions. They didn't even have the consciousness to know that there was a difficulty, and had no outside help been given, the race must have died out. Therefore the angels from the moon, who were the guardians of mankind, herded the sexes together in great temples at times when the interplanetary lines of force were propitious to propagation, and thus they perpetuated the race. It was also proposed that when the brain had been completed, the lords of Mercury, elder brothers of our present humanity, who excelled in intelligence, should teach us how to use the mind and make it truly creative, so that we would no longer be dependent upon the separate sexual process of generation now in vogue. Thus, by the work of these two great hierarchies, we were raised from unconsciousness to the first stage of creative intelligence, from plant to God.
Now, I would like to clarify that these are not Bill Cooper's beliefs. He was merely speaking from the perspective of the modern alchemist and occultist. What should be obvious to anyone who has studied the occult in any measure is that the story always reflects the Luciferian doctrine. That is to say, Satan was responsible for freeing mankind from the clutches of the evil god Yahweh and his prison, the Garden of Eden. The alchemical account is simply more elegant and detailed, yet still retains many interesting attributes from angels, Elohim, and hierarchies from Mercury and the moon. But for this video, my focus is on the idea that humanity, prior to our current state, was a hermaphrodite, male-female, and how that perspective fuels the modern transhumanist movement and furthermore shapes the potential identity of the Antichrist. There are two reasons why I believe this is an important point to consider. One, the advent of transhumanism is actively promoting the end of gender. Two, there is a possibility that the Antichrist will be androgynous. We have seen a healthy attack on the traditional family in the last century. While issues within the traditional, or even better, the biblical sense of family has always been at stake, it seems modern culture and society have ramped up in contemporary America, first with the women's rights movement, and now with the cultural support of homosexuality. Let me be very clear here that I don't think women's rights is necessarily evil or satanic. However, I do think it was a huge chink in the armor when it came to the traditional sense of family. Like any view, extremism is harmful and destructive. But even women I know, such as my wife, believes that the rise in divorce and the decline of masculinity in America has a direct correlation with the over-empowerment of women in society and the advent of freedom of choice. And also take note that some have touted that the entire women's rights movement was part of the globalists' plan to break down society because they wanted to tax women, and in order to do that, they had to get women into the workforce. But I digress. But a second leg to this attack is homosexuality. I have friends who are homosexual and consider themselves transgender, and I sincerely love them as fellow image bearers of God. Please understand that my opinions and comments here on homosexuality are at the cultural and societal level and not an attack on any individual. But it is true that the rise in homosexuality, or at least the acceptance of it, has been a huge detriment to the traditional family model. And before I get thumping on the Bible, let's look at this from a very practical, natural sense. Society and the human race is built on the function of the male and female mating and producing children. If the cycle stops, the human race goes extinct. With this in mind, one can claim that homosexuality is unnatural from the naturalist perspective. But because of our broken society, gay couples have had the opportunity to raise foster children, or even better, with the advent of technology, have had the capacity to create their own progeny with the help of test tubes. And while the topic of homosexuality is highly debated, especially amongst the religious and anti-religious camps, my goal here is to tie this all back to alchemy and the mystical traditions that stem back from antiquity. And as a side note, if you go visit canarycryradio.com, episode number 073, we did the gay episode where we talked to a couple of guys who have a ministry of grace and not condemnation towards the homosexual community. Given these cultural breakdowns in gender line, it's no surprise to mention that androgyny is nothing new for someone like myself, who was born on the dawn of the generation labeled millennials. The music and entertainment industry has been notorious for blurring the lines between gender for decades. Michael Jackson, Bret Michaels, David Bowie, Adam Lambert, Boy George, Marilyn Manson, just to name a few, are male musicians who all had their image bear the resemblance of being in touch with their feminine side. Then you have Lady Gaga, Grace Jones, Annie Lennox, Patti Smith, and Katie Lang, just to name a few female rock stars who resembled a more masculine look. So given the climate regarding gender ambiguity, where are we headed, especially in light of transhumanism? In an article by Peter Wicks on the IEET, that's the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies website, entitled The End of Gender, a fascinating and startling proposition is made. Quote, "There are at least 3 reasons to suspect that gender is on its way out. Firstly, the trend towards increasing insistence on choosing the socially constructed aspects of one's gender, whether it concerns sexual orientation, how to dress, what kind of roles to play in society, how we refer to ourselves, and insist on being referred to by others or whatever, seems set to continue, at least in the developed world. Secondly, surgical techniques enabling de facto alterations of our biological gender, at least at the macroscopic level, are becoming increasingly sophisticated and are thus enabling increased alignment of our apparent biological gender with our wishes. Thirdly, and most radically, we may be on the verge of being able to tinker massively with our DNA, with the result that even at the genetic level, we might find ourselves able to blur the boundaries between male XY and female XX to a far greater extent than nature has done for us. And once gender becomes a matter of choice rather than of nature's providence, there is no reason why there should be only 2, 3, or even 4 of them. And once gender splinters, like political parties and religious denominations, into categories that are limited only by the human imagination, the term gender seems likely to become increasingly inappropriate as a description of reality." End quote. Can you imagine a society where gender is simply a choice? Anything goes. With the scientific and technological power that is behind transhumanism, such a world is right around the corner. And that means your children and their children will be facing a culture and a society who champions freedom of choice, which will enable them to choose their gender should they decide to practice their freedoms. What's even more alarming is that the alchemical translation of the creation of Adam and Eve will most certainly be used as a way to justify these choices as something the church at large can accept. Here's the logic. They will bring up Genesis 1:27, quote, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female he created he them." The traditional interpretation is that God created man, or humanity, in his image, and that the humanity he created was male and female. But the alchemical interpretation sees this as avid proof that Adam was androgynous. This brings up many fascinating theological questions and points to discussions such as, will there be gender in heaven? Or is God androgynous? Such questions deserve its own video, but for now, I simply want to show that with good demonic logic, one can twist the biblical account to promote an androgynous origin to humanity. So the big picture idea here is that transhumanism is the fulfillment of the alchemical dream of reaching godhood. If we refer back to the Bill Cooper quote, the initiate can realize that this separation of gender was simply a necessary step in our transition and evolution from plant to God. And given our progress in conscious evolution and our maturing intellect with the capacity to grab our own human destiny by the throat, man can once again return to a state of androgyny where we will have graduated from the duality of gender and rise to the becoming of a divine race. But there's one more aspect to androgyny that I want to tackle in this post, and that's the question of, will the Antichrist be androgynous? Certainly after seeing the potential direction of gender given transhumanism, the thought of the Antichrist being androgynous is not all that crazy. But the main question would be, is there biblical support for this statement? The quick answer is yes. Daniel 11:37 is the verse that raises the possibility that the Antichrist will be androgynous. Quote, "Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all." For the traditional prophecy scholar, it might seem absurd to picture a gender-bender Antichrist figure who would captivate the world so much that he would bring false peace to Israel by warring the neighboring nations with the people screaming, "Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" Revelation 13:4. But given this passage, the possibility exists. We know that the Antichrist will compare himself to all other gods and God himself, claiming to be above them all, Isaiah 14. So in essence, his own worship of himself or herself will be greater than anything else. And while the reality of the Antichrist being androgynous is in some aspects trivial and irrelevant to the overall fulfillment of Bible prophecy, thinking about this also makes me ponder a couple of other possibilities. First, if the great deception that L.A. Marzulli and others always talk about is true, then the Antichrist might be a Nephilim, or perhaps present himself/herself as an alien savior. If that scenario were to play out, then androgyny would make perfect sense because this alien would not be identified by gender necessarily, but to us would be a god, a spiritually evolved being who would confirm all the traditions of the ancient mysteries. The second possibility, given the work of author Peter Goodgame in his writings The Giza Discovery, would be that the Antichrist will be the Nimrod figure that we read about in Genesis 10. The potential connection I want to highlight here is that one of the gods worshipped in ancient Egypt is Akhenaten. This figure was touted as a male but represented with wide hips like a female, making his gender ambiguous. There are other Egyptian gods such as Thoth, whose gender was also unidentified. But the point is, if the rendering of Revelation 13:3 and Revelation 17:10 are correct by Mr. Good Game, then perhaps the Antichrist will be the resurrection of an ancient Egyptian god, perhaps Akhenaten, or another figure whose gender is ambiguous. These ideas obviously deserve a far deeper study, but for this video I simply wanted to highlight the trials of transhumanism, and in particular the topic of androgyny and the Antichrist. I hope you're able to pick up on the severity and urgency of the times we are living in, given these circumstances that we face. I believe it is important to discuss these issues and raise awareness regarding them, because not only might it help someone experiencing an identity crisis concerning their gender, but more importantly, we can save souls. I want to end this video with this passage by Jesus Christ that I have read and mentioned many times regarding these end times, but nevertheless gives me chills every single time. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Matthew 24:22. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Take care.